Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of Chasing Lincoln's Killer, a podcast by Mr. Robbins for Mr. Robbins' class. Now, I need you to go back in time to the year 1861 when the Civil War is beginning and the United States was split in half, and we had the northern half of the country and the southern half of the country at war. Towards the end of the war, right after the war ends, there are still people very upset with President Lincoln. He had a very famous mantra about malice towards none and charity for all, meaning he wanted the country to be back together again. But there were people from the North who were upset with that, and there were people from the South who were upset with that. And Abraham Lincoln actually had a drawer in his office desk full of assassination letters from people from the North, from people from the South. And he had dreams, actually, or nightmares, if you want to say, but of people wanting to kill him. And he knew that if that was a possibility, then there's not a lot he could do to stop it, especially back then. There were not big security details for the president. If you wanted to walk up to the front door of the White House in 1865, knock on the front door and ask to see the president, you could. It was that kind of time where you could just walk into the White House and ask to speak to the president. We don't really think of it that way now. But back in 1865, if you can go back in your mind to the time of horses and trains, this is going to be a fascinating tale of a man named John Wilkes Booth, who was originally from Maryland. And we're going to discuss him, what his intentions were, and ultimately what came about with the assassination of President Lincoln. Now, for today's episode, I just need to go give you a little bit of background about John Wilkes Booth. He was an actor. He was born into a famous acting family in the United States, the Booth family. They were very well known. He was born in Maryland. John Wilkes Booth was. Towards the end of the war, he became a sympathizer for the South. That means he thought the South was correct in trying to quit the United States. And as John Wilkes Booth, during the Civil War, he begins to become really upset with President Lincoln. But about John Wilkes Booth. The bizarre part about it is he is so famous during the time. He's the most famous actor in America. He's considered the most handsome man in America in 1864, which is fascinating. And there's stories about when people would watch him during a play, they would just follow him across the stage. John Wilkes Booth was 25 years old at the end of the Civil War, 26 years old maybe. And he originally comes up with a plan to kidnap the President of the United States. And he has some friends with him, George Atzerodt, Lewis Payne, David Harold is another one that we'll talk about. And these particular conspirators, they're called, come up with a plan to kidnap President Lincoln. Now, their reason for kidnapping President Lincoln is they believed that now that the Civil War is over, that if they could kidnap President Lincoln and get him into the southern part of the country, then they were going to trade, after they captured him, they're going to trade President Lincoln to release all the prisoners of war that the North was holding for the South. So they had a plan. Mary Surratt is a name you'll hear me talk about once in a while. She owned a boarding house, which is like a little bed and breakfast kind of thing. And John Surratt and his co-conspirators would meet in her house. That's going to become later on very important. So I'm giving you some names for the future. Lewis Payne, David Harold, Spangler, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt. Now, as we go forward in time a little bit, the kidnapping plot isn't really going to work. They've figured out as time goes by that the kidnapping plot is not going to work any longer, so they're going to come up with a plan to assassinate. Now, an assassination is murder for a political reason. Okay, that's what an assassination is. Now, the original plan, which will be coming up in episode 2, their plan was to assassinate a lot of people. They were going to assassinate the President of the United States. They were going to assassinate the Vice President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. They were going to assassinate the Secretary of State, William Seward. And all of this was their plan to assassinate most of the United States government leaders so that the South could restart the war and gain their independence from the North. It's a bizarre plan. He felt confident that it could work. Now, if you think about what I was saying about how famous John Wilkes Booth was, it must have been incredibly bizarre to have a very famous actor at the time coming up with a plan to assassinate the President of the United States. It's not like he could hide anywhere if he was caught, because everybody knew who he was. Now, in episode 2, we're going to talk about what the plan was and who the people were to carry it out. And then in episode 3, we will talk about after John Wilkes Booth assassinates President Lincoln, he gets away. And there is a manhunt across the entire country trying to find out where John Wilkes Booth is and who helped him. So that's going to wrap up episode 1 today. And hopefully you learned a little bit. And tomorrow I will get to you with episode 2. Welcome, Room 24, to episode 2 of the Lincoln Assassination. Today's episode will be brought to you by the egg sandwich that I'm eating right now. It is delightful. And of course the cup of coffee that's with it every day. Yesterday, in episode 1, we were discussing a little bit about the past of John Wilkes Booth and where he was from and what his beliefs were and how this all came about at the end of the Civil War. And the Civil War ends in 1865. Booth really begins, after the kidnapping plot that we talked about, to talk about the assassination of President Lincoln with some of his co-conspirators. And conspirators are people who are planning it with him. So we pick up today's episode with Booth, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and Lewis Payne all meeting at Mary Surratt's boarding house. Again, a boarding house is kind of like a bed and breakfast type of thing, and that's where Booth held these meetings. Now, if Mary Surratt was part of this or not, we really don't know. But after their kidnapping plot changes to an assassination plot, Booth, Atzerodt, Harold, and Payne all begin a mass assassination plot. John Wilkes Booth was going to assassinate President Lincoln at Ford's Theater. George Atzerodt was going to assassinate Vice President Johnson, who was staying at the hotel. I think it was called the National Hotel. Lewis Payne was to assassinate Secretary of State Seward, who was home at the time in bed because he'd actually fallen off a horse and was injured. And David Harold was going to be the organizer of everything like their horses. And all of this had to take place at the exact same time, because if one of them did something before the others, then obviously security and the police would figure something was up. Now, Abraham Lincoln liked to go to the theater. It was a distraction for him. In Washington, D.C., Ford's Theater is still downtown Washington, D.C. It's a tourist attraction. People can go see. It still looks the exact same. Many of my students have gone in the past while they were in Washington, D.C. Now, that particular night, it was a Friday night, Mr. President Lincoln's wife, Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, didn't really want to go to the theater. She didn't want to go that night. She complained of headaches a lot, but she knew that her husband really wanted to go. So she said she would go. Now, the interesting thing is people knew that President Lincoln was not a very well-liked man by some people. So the president asked someone to go, and they said no. And then he asked somebody else to go, and they said no. And then they asked somebody else to go, and they said no. Now, can you imagine if the President of the United States asked you to go out to watch a play with him and sit in the President's box, and you said, no thank you. I'd rather not be near you right now, Mr. President. They didn't say that, but who knows if they thought it. So I think he ended up asking like 7 or 8 different people before finally a major from the Union Army, a Major Rathbone, decided to go with him. Now, the play that night at Ford's Theater was a play called Our American Cousin. The leading actress was a woman by the name of Laura Keene, who was well known. The important part, though, is you got to remember yesterday how John Wilkes Booth was a very famous actor. He had performed at Ford's Theater many times, so when he heard that President Lincoln was going to be there that night, he decided that was their night. Now, John Wilkes Booth knew all the secret passages. He knew all the backstage routes, all the ways to get under the stage and up into the balconies without anybody really knowing. President Lincoln that night was sitting in the president's box. Okay, if you can imagine a theater with a couple thousand seats in it, there's a stage, and if you're staring at the stage, up to your right and up to your left, there are boxes, kind of. And the president's box was up to the right. It had a picture of George Washington in it, the American flag's there, and the president's box would have been the first box, if you're staring at the stage, up to the top on the right-hand side of the stage. So as the play's going on, and the president and Mrs. Lincoln and Mr. Rathbone and I think it was his wife was there were 4 of them, the president's bodyguard couldn't see the play. So he left. He left the president's box and went down into the audience so he could see the play better. Can you imagine? The president's bodyguard left. He wanted to see the play. So, John Wilkes Booth is creeping around the backstage. He knows the president's there. He goes around to the backside as the play's going on, and again, he's John Wilkes Booth. He's an incredibly famous actor, so nobody really is paying any attention to him because he's at a theater where plays take place. So he goes around the back, goes up the stairs where the president's box is, and he had drilled a little teeny hole in the president's box that day so that he could see through the hole to make sure the president was in there. So he does, and he creeps in, he looks through the hole, he creeps in, goes in. Now the play's going on. The president's box is relatively big. It has big chairs in it, so the 4 people in the president's box are all looking down, watching the play. There's curtains, so John Wilkes Booth sneaks in, quietly shuts the door, and blocks the door with a piece of wood. Now, meanwhile, George Atzerodt is planning to go find Vice President Andrew Johnson. Lewis Payne is off to Secretary of State Seward's house, and David Harold is organizing their escape routes into the darkness and into the night. So then, and again, John Wilkes Booth knows this play, so he's waiting for the perfect time, and he knows there is one line in this play, Our American Cousin, where the crowd is going to erupt in laughter. And if you can imagine a couple thousand people all bursting out in laughter at the same time in a theater, it's going to be loud. So that's the moment when he knows he's going to take out his little Derringer revolver, not a revolver, it's a one-shot thing, and just as about that part of the play is going to happen, and he knows what he has to do, or what he thinks is right, even though the entire world knows this is a terrible thing to do. Thank you for listening to episode 2. You'll have to tune into episode 3 of Mr. Robbins' Class podcast to find out what happens in the next episode. Have a nice weekend, class. Welcome to episode 3 of the Lincoln Assassination. I hope everyone had a nice weekend. I left you off last Friday with John Wilkes Booth entering the presidential box at Ford's Theater while President Lincoln, his wife, and Major Rathbone, his guests, were watching the play Our American Cousin. If you remember, Booth had silently crept up the back staircase, gone into the presidential box, and shut the door and barred it from behind. John Wilkes Booth was waiting for a certain line during the play when a crowd of 2,000, 3,000 people would erupt in laughter. Now remember, he was an actor. He knew the play well, so he knew what moment he was waiting for. And as the line came to, I think it was something like, you socked up an old man trap, the crowd erupts in laughter. Noise deafening throughout the theater. John Wilkes Booth pulls out his little revolver and from about 4 feet away fires one single shot at President Lincoln. It hits him in the back of the head. Lincoln slumps forward. Now, during this commotion, Major Rathbone hears and sees what's going on because he's so close, and he jumps up and starts to begin attacking John Wilkes Booth. But John Wilkes Booth pulls out a knife, like a dagger type of thing, and kind of slashes at Rathbone's forearm a little bit and cuts him. Not anything terrible, but he cut him. And John Wilkes Booth then jumps out of the presidential box and down to the stage, which is a jump of about 10 feet, and lands on the stage. Now, in the process of jumping down, he breaks a small bone in his ankle. Okay. Now, don't forget, you're at a theater, at a play, and John Wilkes Booth is the most famous actor. So John Wilkes Booth still has the knife in his hand. He goes onto the middle of the stage and yells out, "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus always the tyrants. It's the Virginia state motto. Now, people in the audience are confused because they think it's part of the play, and it's John Wilkes Booth. Meanwhile, just as that's about to happen, someone yells, "The president's been shot, the president's been shot." John Wilkes Booth runs across the stage that you can see in the picture, out the side door, jumps on a horse, and escapes into the darkness of the night. As someone yells out, "The president's been shot, the president's been shot," the crowd erupts into hysterics and pandemonium, and it's chaos, and everybody's trying to flee. A couple of doctors rush up to President Lincoln's box to see what they can do to help, and President Lincoln is not dead. He's unconscious, and he's not dead. Now, if you can remember, medicine back then is not what medicine is today, and doctors did not have the skills or the tools and the machines that they do now. And all they can really do is make President Lincoln comfortable as he's unconscious. So they carry him downstairs out the theater, and they can't risk a carriage ride through the cobbled streets of Washington, D.C. at the time. So they bring him across the street to the Peterson boarding house, which is, again, I keep saying boarding house. It's like a bed and breakfast. They bring him into one of the bedrooms on the first floor and lay him into one of the beds. And there's just a steady stream of people visiting him that night. Gideon Wells, all of the people who are, his family. Meanwhile, while Booth had escaped into the darkness, you remember this was a plan for more than just President Lincoln. Lewis Payne went to the house of Secretary of State Seward, went upstairs, and he was going to try to assassinate him, but he kind of botched up the whole thing, and he just ran off into the darkness yelling, I'm mad," meaning he's crazy. So Secretary of State Seward did not die. George Atzerodt, who was supposed to go and assassinate Vice President Johnson at the same time, basically didn't do anything. He never even left his house and never even went to see President Johnson that night. They did find a bunch of plans in George Atzerodt's hotel room linking Booth and all these people to what they were trying to do. So as Lincoln was across the street, he did not. The play was actually on Good Friday, which is coming up, and Lincoln did not. He stayed unconscious the rest of the night. He never regained consciousness. Mary Lincoln, his wife, his oldest son, Robert Tad Lincoln, who I think was 18 at the time, came to see him, and he'd never regained consciousness that night. And the next morning, his breathing slowed a little bit, and he passed away. And there's a famous line from General Edwin Stanton. It goes, "There lies the most perfect ruler of men. Now he belongs to the ages." There's discrepancy. Some people think he said angels, but in the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, had been killed by an assassin. Meanwhile, as Booth had escaped into darkness with David Harold and Lewis Payne, the greatest manhunt search in the history of the United States was about to begin, because John Wilkes Booth had angered a nation, and he had to be found. So, episode 4 will deal with the chase of John Wilkes Booth. Welcome to episode 4 of Chasing Lincoln's Killer and the Abraham Lincoln Assassination in 1865. As I left off in episode 3, John Wilkes Booth had escaped into the darkness. President Lincoln had been brought across the street from Ford's Theater to the Peterson boarding house, where he died early the next morning. John Wilkes Booth and David Harold met up shortly after this. They escaped. Both riding horses, they got to the... Now, all of the river crossings had been ordered closed after the assassination attempt, but again, I'm going to go back to John Wilkes Booth was an incredibly famous person at the time. So when he got to the river crossing, he told the Union soldiers there that he was John Wilkes Booth and he had been given permission to cross the river. So he did. And he escaped into Maryland. John Wilkes Booth and David Harold rode into the darkness, and they stopped at the Surratt Tavern. If you remember in an earlier episode, I talked about Mary Surratt, who owned a boarding house and tavern where John Wilkes Booth met with his co-conspirators. They picked up some weapons at the Surratt boarding house that he had told her to leave for him, and they rode off into the darkness. Now, every step that the horse took, John Wilkes Booth's... Remember, he broke his leg jumping off the stage. We have all this information, too, because John Wilkes Booth kept a diary with him while he was escaping into the woods, and he wrote down, and he wanted the newspapers from the next morning so that he could see. He believed he was going to be a hero from the South, and he couldn't understand why the entire country was so angry with him for what he had done. They rode off, and then on April 15th, the next day, they arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Dr. Mudd was often considered a Confederate sympathizer as well, and he set to fixing John Wilkes Booth's broken leg. Now, later on, you're going to find out that Dr. Mudd said he was not aware of the assassination attempt. There was not news reports or radios or televisions back then. Dr. Mudd claims he had no idea of the assassination attempt. Now, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold spent the night out in the woods outside of Dr. Mudd's home. Now, an interesting side note, there's a famous line that people use sometimes throughout history that his name is Mudd. Meaning that the name is forever not thought very highly of, and that saying, consider his name Mudd, or your name is considered Mudd, goes back to Dr. Mudd helping John Wilkes Booth, in essence, escape that night. The next day, Booth and Harold again continued on. They were trying to escape down into Virginia, where they felt they would be safe from the wrath of the government that was trying to find them. They stayed in the woods a couple nights. John Wilkes Booth would send orders to get him the newspaper so he could keep aware of what was going on and who was trying to catch him. Now, again, the assassination attempt took place on April 14th. Now it's April 16th, April 17th, April 18th, 19th, 20th. John Wilkes Booth and David Harold are still escaping the law and on the run. They're staying in the woods, they're staying in cabins they can find. And eventually, on April 22nd, 23rd, they cross the river from Maryland into Virginia. But the Union Army's getting tips as to where they are. And on the day of April 24th, John Wilkes Booth arrives at the Garrett farm in Virginia. And he and David Harold are inside of a barn, and the Union Army has found them. And the Union Army has surrounded the barn, but they have strict orders to capture John Wilkes Booth alive. Inside of the barn, what they do, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold are yelling back and forth to the Union soldiers, and the Union Army sets fire to the barn, trying to get John Wilkes Booth and David Harold to surrender. And still under strict orders, a Union soldier, Corbett, fires his gun through a tiny crack in the boards and hits John Wilkes Booth in the neck and paralyzes him. David Harold comes out, surrenders, and John Wilkes Booth is dragged out of the burning barn by the Union soldiers. They bring him to the front porch of the Garrett farm, and Booth has been shot, and he's paralyzed because he was shot in the neck, and for some reason he asks to see his hands, and he looks at his hands and he says, "Useless, useless." And John Wilkes Booth died. The presidential assassin was dead on April 26, 1865, 12 days after the assassination. In the weeks that follow, there was a trial. John Wilkes Booth, I had just mentioned, was killed. David Harold, Lewis Payne, George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, they're all brought before a judge in a military tribunal. They're found guilty. They're executed. They're hanged by the federal government. Mary Surratt was the first woman hanged. And one of the commanders at the arsenal, so to speak, said, "Let us speak of their names no more." Lincoln's funeral train, a train went up and around the country so that people could pay their respects. And that's a summary of the Lincoln assassination and the unfortunate events that surround it. Tomorrow, I'm going to have you watch a couple videos around this. The Ford's Theater virtual tour will get you a little bit more of an idea what's going on. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. It's a fascinating story and a sad part of our history that really wasn't that long ago. And I hope you learned something from the podcasts. Have a good afternoon.